Thanks everybody for coming. Really excited to welcome author Summer Brennan to Google. My name is Chris Manning. I'm on the legal team here at Google, and I'm also a huge environmental advocate, which is sort of how I came to invite Summer to Google. And I'm really excited to hear her talk about sort of some of the history of Drakes Bay Oyster Farm and some of Point Reyes' history and the history of oysters in the area. So I hope it'll be exciting for you guys as well. Summer's an author. This is her first book, The Oyster War. She's also had a number of publications and other, number of stories in other publications, such as McSweeney's, The Rumpus, The Believer Logger. So she's been doing this for a little while. She writes professionally for the United Nations Press Office as well. So again, she's got some experience, and really excited to talk about her first book, The Oyster War. So I'm going to go ahead and welcome you up, Summer. We're going to do sort of a Q&A conversation between the two of us, back and forth, and additionally, Summer's going to read a little bit from her book to give you guys sort of, what's that?
Yeah, as it does a tiny bit.
Yeah, just a tiny bit, just to give you guys sort of the flavor of her writing style and also just what's going on in the book, and we'll use that as sort of an intro. So without further ado, Summer, welcome to Google.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for...
Well, I guess just as a way of tiny introduction. I don't know if anyone's heard of sort of what this book is about. There was a conflict inside Point Reyes National Seashore, which is just north of here, as you may know, about an oyster farm that had been there for a while and whether or not it would get to stay past 2012. And so this story became, seemed like a little tempest in a teapot, but it actually ended up sort of getting all this national press and almost went to the Supreme Court and was a big thing. So I wrote a book about it, and chronologically, it stretches rather widely. I think it goes back to sometime BC at some points, just because I've tried to get the, a little bit of the geological history and the anthropological history of the area. So I thought I'd just read just one paragraph at the start of chapter 3. And so actually, this goes back to the 19th century. So, okay, so I'll just read something. So it's The Fable of the California Oyster. The oyster pirates preferred to ambush the beds by moonlight. Working mostly in pairs, with 2 men per vessel, they mustered together in ramshackle armadas of 30 or 40 small boats. They waited until cloudless nights when the full moon shone brightly on the piles of pale shells on shore before advancing on the oyster company's camps en masse, their pistols at the ready. They went by nicknames like the porpoise, the centipede, the spider, or the shark. One particularly vicious character, known for trying to tear off the faces of his opponents in hand-to-hand combat, was known simply as Scratch. Their ranks included petty thieves and notorious murderers, fishermen gone crooked and adventuring youths. And in 1897, among their number was a 20-year-old undercover fish patrol agent by the name of John Griffith Cheney, better known to you and me as Jack London. So just a little taste, and it goes on from there. Yeah.
Very awesome.
Okay,
good,
thanks.
Good taste of the sort of local flavor that I think this book definitely offers, and being in the Bay Area, I think it's very, very appropriate. So you mentioned a little bit about sort of what the overall story is about. Can you tell us why it was such a big deal? Like what was going on here that sort of pulled on both sides of the community that really made this such a contentious issue?
Sure. Well, everybody got involved with it for different individual reasons. You can't speak for anyone on either side. But on the one hand, which came to be called sort of the pro-oyster farm camp, the argument was that bad science had been used to imply or prove that this oyster farm was environmentally detrimental, and so they were trying to push it out. And so they sort of saw this as a bigger story about kind of an out-of-control government that was acting capriciously and picking on the little guy in some sense. And so that was sort of on the one hand. And on the other hand, there was a concern that because this was inside a wilderness area, not just a national park, that it would create a very dangerous precedent for future wilderness protection. And we've never had a wilderness area be taken away or undone. So this would have been the first time that would have been compromised in some way. And so even if people liked the farm or thought it wasn't harmful to allow it to continue, that was the fear, that it could open up. And as you get into in the story, they weren't the only people that thought that might be something they could do with it. So, yeah.
Cool. Well, since we're at Google and you mentioned science, I thought I kind of borrowed a question. I'll call it borrowed, really stealing a question from another interview that I read about this book, actually, that I thought was really interesting just around the question of science. So what kind of research, I guess, maybe to start off with, what kind of research did you have to do scientifically wise to sort of understand both sides of what was going on here?
Well, there was a lot of science reports done around this, and I have, in my appendices, I have 9 of them listed because those were sort of the key ones, and people were confused, like, what's going on? So I didn't do any scientific research myself,
Sure.
But I surveyed the reports that went out about it, and they were basically just trying to discern what's the impact to this fragile ecosystem from this company. But mostly they were from secondary sources, so there was very little primary research being gathered. And it was sort of interesting to see how these older studies or things that were done elsewhere and repurposed for this area were sort of rehashed and spun out in different ways that some people thought were good and other people were very critical of.
And a topic like this, sort of about the environment and more biologically speaking, do you feel that maybe you came to understand some of the limitations of science and how it might apply to this type of field?
Well, I guess it just depends on what kind of science you're doing. Yeah,
Sure.
I mean, and I think there's people. One of the most interesting things about this conflict actually was how people had maybe higher expectations of certain scientific processes than were realistic for the situation. So, to understand that these things are an evolving process, and sometimes scientists do make mistakes. So there was everything was. This was spotlight on this whole thing. So if anybody messed up or interpreted a study a different way, it was seen as maybe it was intentional. And so
Sure.
Yeah, so it kind of drifted away from the more collaborative and evolving process that so much of the biological sciences are, where you work with what information you can and just keep going from there.
So sort of spun in different directions
Yeah.
and things like that too, based on the side. Yeah, I think it's probably generally true. So how did you get sort of involved with this story? Like what captivated you about it, or how did you get your intro in it?
So I grew up out near Point Reyes in West Marin, and went east for college. Before then, I grew up out there, and I had never heard of this conflict before. I knew of the oyster farm and obviously the park, but I got tired of living in New York City after a while. I've been working there for a long time, and I decided to move back home for a while. So I got a job at a local paper, and this was the main story they were working on. So I kind of got sort of thrown into the mix, and right away introduced to key people and sent hundreds of pages of research and opinion, and so it was a lot.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it probably would have been a lot to take on all at once.
It's fascinating.
Pull in. Cool. Did you sort of have any initial feelings when you went into it about maybe how you would have sided with like one side or the other, or did you like just really try to let the facts speak for themselves?
Well, I mean, I would think of myself as being in the latter camp, but without sort of realizing it, I just kind of was dropped right into the middle of the pro kind of oyster farm group, because the paper was working as a support system and had ties to people that were some of its main advocates. So I started out very much mostly just hearing that one side of the story and reasons in favor of the oyster farm and why, and not just the farm itself, but the separate issue of why it should be able to stay. So my views of it changed sort of over time with more research.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
You've sort of alluded to this a little bit, I think, but can you elaborate a little bit more on maybe some of the people that were involved in the story, or like how you got to know them during the research process and that kind of thing, and just sort of maybe why they felt so vehemently one side or the other?
Sure. Well, I guess there's a couple different questions there. I mean, let's see. In terms of the people that are involved, I had to, I'll answer it this way. For writing the book, I had to sort of choose people from different sections of groups that were involved in this to highlight, because there were so many people involved, and ranching community and different people in the agricultural community, environmentalists. And so while many of them are mentioned in the book, I had to sort of pick out a story from each kind of faction, so to speak, to illustrate it. So there's a rancher in here who's a friend of mine, named Joey Mendoza, and he's like a third generation cattleman. He actually just passed away a couple of weeks ago, unfortunately. But so I tell his family history in here, and he kind of to give the voice of some of the agricultural community and their experiences. And
Cool.
yeah, I don't know. I picked one of the environmentalists to highlight, and et cetera, and with the oyster family. And just in terms of why people were so enthusiastic about it or passionate about this, I think it varied, but I did get a sense of a sort of a panic about the way the world is changing, and a sense of running out of space or running out of time to protect certain things, whether that's small family farming or environmental protection of areas. And I that's one of the things that really drew me to it was I do think we're at this kind of this juncture where people are realizing we really do have to take action on a lot of this, because they're seeing these things get steamrolled.
So there's some other oyster farms in Point Reyes as well. Folks here may have been to them. Tamales Bay, Hog Island. How did those groups? Were they a part of this story at all, or did they have like a stake in the legal claim?
Well,
or
they were,
anything?
especially at the end. Tamales Bay Oyster Company ended up being part of a lawsuit. That there was a bundle of companies ended up launching their own lawsuit at the end, because they were arguing that the closure of Drakes Bay Oyster Farm would impact their own businesses. But that lawsuit was dismissed as frivolous by the judge. But they were, it's a community, people are neighbors and friends, and they wanted to support people that they knew, so it definitely had a lot of local support.
To that point, I think this is a very local story that you're describing here, but did you find that there was also a lot broader implications in some ways, and what were those? Well,
absolutely, I did, and I think, as I think I was getting at a little bit, we're at a time where we're trying to figure out how we're going to manage lands that are left, and I think people are realizing that our ideas of what wilderness means are fairly outdated. The Wilderness Act is from 1964, and the way we talk about wilderness is a bit, not to get like kind of academic on people, but it's very much rooted in the sort of colonial ideas, and it's very this sense of, we as Europeans came and found this Eden that it was untouched by man, which is completely false and a myth. And there was, hundreds of thousands of people living here, and from the first contact with Europeans, the population was much, much higher, but diseases winnowed the population down so much that by the time there was a huge influx of Europeans, obviously, especially gold rush era here, what had been a very thriving human population was diminished. So there's sort of these false ideas that we have about wilderness being untouched or being a place where people can't coexist. And so I think it's time to reevaluate those kinds of thoughts. And anyway, I'm rambling, but I think that was sort of at the heart of this story of arguing what belongs in wilderness and what is a wilderness. And,
yeah, I think absolutely. It may seem kind of silly, I guess, but just from my own background in like studying history and things like that, like there's a whole academic distinction between like the John Muir camp and the Gifford Pinchot camp and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's out there.
Right.
Cool. So what sort of initial response have you gotten to the book so far? I imagine there's obviously like heated response in some regards in Point Reyes, but overall on a larger level, has it been generally positive?
Yes, I'm really pleased, actually. I was, we were wondering when we were making this book, is anyone going to care about this little thing? But it's been really great, and living in New York, I've heard from a lot of people in the publishing industry there that have enjoyed it, and so it's been getting some great press. Obviously, locally, it was such a contentious issue that people that were on the losing side are not thrilled to have the story kind of all laid out like this.
Sure.
Yeah.
Cool. That's awesome. I hope the audience will humor me a little bit that I have a few questions that are specifically sort of about writing and your process with writing. Can you maybe share a little bit about your process? And since this is your first book, as I think I mentioned a couple of times, did you find that any tactics particularly worked for you in the process?
I did. I don't know if anyone here is a writer other than having a regular job, but that's sort of what I was doing for part of this. And I read somewhere that nobody wants to hear about how hard it is to write a book because people think it's sort of a privileged thing to be able to do. And so, but it's all true about how hard it is. And I think for a first book especially. But actually, last summer, I was having a lot of difficulty with the writing process, and it just seemed insurmountable. And there was so much information that I was trying to distill. For every page of this book, there's probably 100 pages of research that I maybe needlessly did, but still, just that process was overwhelming. And I ended up taking an online course with Susan Orlean, who's a writer, and it was just pre-recorded, and it seems silly, but she had the best advice for how to work in nonfiction, and taking this volume of information from your research and distilling it down to your notes and typing it up, and just very methodical. And so I sort of adapted and adopted that approach, and so it was unrefined research and then notes and typed notes and then cards and moving them around. And so it was very there was an organized process in that way, but that really helped me
Cool.
to actually finish the book.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. All you budding nonfiction writers out there. Susan Orlean's online course.
It's on Skill. I don't know, like advertising for Skillshare, but it's on Skillshare. It was really great, and it helped me. I was about here, and it helped me get all the way to the end. So.
Cool. Very awesome. Well, I think you spoke to sort of how hard it is to write a book, but can you also mention some of the other things that maybe aren't a part of the writing, but still are part of getting the book out there? Like,
Sure.
I understand you did an IndieGoGo campaign to help fund the book as well. Like, so there's a whole business side and things like that maybe you had to take on.
As people may be aware, publishing is not the richest industry, or at least as compared to it has been. So people talk about, book advances. Maybe not being what they used to be. I don't know, this is my first one, but that's what I've heard. And it's very hard to do a book like this that requires a lot of research. So it's not just something I could do. I mean, I know novels also take travel and research, so I don't mean to disparage that at all. But I had to go to places physically and do a lot of research that that could only happen at a research library during particular hours during the day. And so it was hard to fund it. So I ran out of money to work on it, but I didn't want to give up. So yeah, I did an IndieGoGo campaign and raised just a little over $3,000. So it seems small, but when you're operating on a shoestring budget and just trying to get to your next, the next thing, it helped a lot, actually. So.
My role models as authors and in the academic world are female. And as a follower of yours on Twitter, I've seen that some of your conversations around topics about being a female author.
I talk about feminism a lot.
Can you share anything more about maybe your perspective about being a female author, or maybe if there's any challenges or unique things that you've faced in that capacity?
Well, I've only been a published author for a couple weeks now, so I'm new at it. What can I share? What's the question? What's it like? I mean, what's your perspective like? And did you feel like you encountered any different challenges, or was it a pretty smooth process? I think so. I don't know if I should talk about them. No, I mean, I don't know if people are familiar with Rebecca Solnit, the author, but she has a great famous essay called "Men Explain Things to Me," and it's interesting. It's an interesting read. So I think sometimes. I think there's sort of some ingrained cultural things that people don't necessarily realize they're doing. Sure. And so people will explain my own subject to me, with sort of assume ignorance. And I'm like, I did write a book about it, but thank you for sharing. But you don't want to be rude, and people mean well, and so I don't think it's malicious most of the time. But and I'm not a total spring chicken, but I'm relatively young for authors, and so that might be part of it too. Sure. But I'm still brand new, so I'm sure I'll have lots of other horror stories to tell as it time goes on. Or not, hopefully not.
Yeah, hopefully not. But no, that's cool. I think particularly with a topic that was so contentious to begin with, where people had such personal feelings about it.
Absolutely. Well, there's somebody that's who's in the book that's been critical of the book and doesn't agree with the things that I've laid out, and so I think that I did my research. I have a bibliography. It's all there.
But professional.
Right. But anyway.
Cool.
Interesting. Yeah.
No, that's great. One of the quotations that sort of starts out the book is "Everything not saved will be lost," and it's a line from Nintendo, as you put it in there. How do you understand that quote in the context of your story?
So "Everything not saved will be lost" is such a great, accidentally deep phrase, and when I came across it, I'm not the first person to repurpose that. But I was really struck by it, especially since what I felt was at the core of this book was a fear of loss of different kinds, whether it was of this particular farm or a type of way of life of small farming or the environment, that it was just this sense of urgency. Maybe I'm taking it too literal, but that's really what I got from it, is just this kind of a wake-up call of, everything not saved will be lost. Mm-hmm. So, and it's fun that it's Nintendo.
Yeah, definitely. Since we're in the Bay Area, we're kind of in a time right now of expensive housing. Sort of sometimes the environment seems to become an issue in that maybe we shouldn't protect certain areas because we should build housing there, we should build something to help the economy and that type of thing. Do you think that the conversation around sort of what it means to be wild and where the environment is in a time right now how do you see that sort of playing out, I guess, in the story, but also, I guess, more holistically or on a larger scale?
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, it definitely was a big issue in the story because that was the question, of course, is are we going to have this place for something commercial that is going to be a, community element in the community in terms of creating jobs and some other, food and all that stuff, or whether it can be set aside for an environment. And obviously that is a big issue. And with, economic problems, it's easy to argue for supporting economies over the environment. But the problem is like once you destroy an ecosystem, it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to restore it. But some things, I mean, everything is sort of damaged at this point. I mean, there isn't really any intact ecosystems anywhere in America as they would have existed 300 years ago because of invasive species, from big animals to tiny plants. And, but it's a question that's coming up everywhere, I think.
Do you, so my final question, and then I'm hoping that maybe some folks in the audience have some questions as well, is hopefully kind of a fun one. Do you have a favorite oyster style? Do you like oysters?
Oh gosh, so I love oysters, and yes, I actually like them just raw. So that's my favorite way to have them. Cool. But I like them especially if they have a little bit of the liqueur still left in the shell. So yeah, I eat oysters a lot. It's great. They're really having a renaissance, especially in New York. Almost seems like everywhere has an oyster happy hour now, so it's a good place to stop.
Do you have a favorite oyster place to go from?
Well, actually, I love Grand Central Oyster Bar in Midtown.
Sure.
When I work at the UN, it's close by, so it's a nice place, like on the way home.
How about locally?
Yeah.
And
locally, I think my favorite. Well, I don't want to they're all great.
Yeah.
I like all the oyster farms. I especially like Hog Island Oysters Sweetwaters, because I think those are Hog Island Sweetwaters, I think is what they're called. They're excellent. If you haven't had them, definitely give it a try. Yeah, so.
Cool.
Anyway.
Does anybody in the audience have any questions they'd like to ask Summer? Great.
Sure. Hi.
Thanks so much for being here. It's great to see you. I lived in Inverness from 2008 to 2012, and I attended a couple of town halls, and I knew some people. Whenever people asked me about the story, like what's happening, I would be like, I don't even know where to start. Yeah, it's so complicated, and I'm sort of curious. Like even today, you presented most of your thoughts as questions. Where it's just something that we're grappling with. It's really hard to understand. So I'm curious. I'm looking forward to buying your book today. How you laid the story out and how you sort of decided. Is it sort of chronological or?
So it jumps around a little actually. And I tried to think of it in the planning of the story. Well, so first I actually laid everything out chronologically in my notes. So I made a massive timeline that was 8,000 BC, Miwoks settle in Olima. And then the most recent was, January 1st, oyster farm is gone. And then included within that timeline was everybody's birthdays and death dates and everything. And then I kind of switched it around. So your question was chronological. It's quite chronological towards the end because it sort of just is the momentum of moving through this story where you've got, it's local and then suddenly you've got Koch brother attorneys coming in and Supreme Court and all these people. Yeah. But it does jump around a bit and you're kind of going along chronologically and then I step back to Sir Francis Drake at the beginning of the next section. And,
what would you say the lasting impact of this has been on the community in Point Reyes?
Oh gosh. Well, I think that's still being figured out to a degree. It's still a very hotly contested, debated issue. I mean, with the book coming out, it sort of flared up, and there's been some angry things in the newspaper, and people that violently dislike the book, and other people that are absolutely thrilled with it, and so locally, I think it has created some lasting divisions between some people in the agricultural community and in the environmental community, because there's some trust that's been lost there. And I think that also, and with the national park too. So people that feel that they handle this very badly, they're nervous about anything that they do. So there's other issues popping up with tule elk management and different things that require public input that I think that they're trying to soothe over, but are still, those tensions are still felt, I think. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
So I guess my question is from maybe a broader perspective throughout the course of your research. Obviously, one of the core tenets that we're kind of grappling with is the rise of agriculture and how that kind of fits in with our environment. Were you optimistic as you learn more about modern farming techniques? And do you feel like these two are going to be able to reconcile in the future, where we can kind of have a successful and large society that reconciles with our environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think I work with this stuff a little bit with the UN as well. And I think what's encouraging is that we have the technology to do all these things sustainably, even our energy production and our transportation. It's just a question of implementing the systems, is my take on it. And that's the same with agriculture as well. So there's different obstacles to that. And some of them are finances. I mean, and other times there's just people that are in powerful positions, or they have industries that they don't want to see go. So that's where you run into, it's hard to make that transition, I think. So it's technically possible. I just hope that we can make it economically possible as well. And I mean, this was a lot about fisheries, as the agriculture, but it's an oyster farm, so I had to look a lot at that. And we do need to drastically change how we handle fishing and seafood, because fish stocks, I think, are projected to collapse in 50 years if we don't change. So I hope we can change that.
I'd be interested to know how your sort of work at the UN has also influenced some of the stuff that you were able to write in this story. Did you find that to be the case at all, or like maybe the systems thinking part?
Yeah, I think it helped me to take a bit of a step back from it. I mean, working as a reporter in Point Reyes, I started in 2012, so I guess you were still there. You can get a little myopic about the whole thing and start looking. But when you step back and look at the bigger picture in the context of climate change and ocean acidification, and even just in conflicts in general. In the book, I compare it to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which some people think is kind of funny. Like Leonard Lopate laughed about that when I was on his show. But it did remind me of that in a way. You can kind of see that anytime you're in conflict about something, especially if it's over land or something, same things kind of come up again and again. So yeah, I think it really helped me, especially since it was such a personal story, like step back a little bit and see it for the themes that it is, and recurring issues. Yeah.
Cool. Any other questions in the audience?
I guess my perspective of the Wilderness Act, or my understanding of the intent there, is that it protects areas such there's no human activity. It belongs to nature, and the primary thing that it prevents against is any sort of man-made building or man-made, and commerce is definitely that's very man-made, and that's definitely commerce has huge impact on the environment. So I guess I wonder I was curious what your perspective was, because it sounded like you had changed your perspective over time, through working in a newspaper and whatnot. But also, I guess broadly, is my understanding of the Wilderness Act, am I wrong?
No, you're right. So the Wilderness Act, the language is a little poetic. I'm going to misquote it here, but it's something along the lines of a wilderness it's an area that's where the works of man are not dominated or something, and it's where the community of nature is untrammeled, and where man is a visitor but does not remain. So that's a mangled version of that line. But you're absolutely right. It's that it's set aside not for mankind, and we can visit, we can go take a hike there, but we can't, ride our mountain bikes, and it's not supposed to be roads, not supposed to be buildings, definitely not supposed to be private businesses. So I think so I agree with that. So that is what the Wilderness Act was saying, and when wilderness is designated, that is the purpose. Along with that, when that happened, there's also writings that spoke about it in an Edenic, humanless way that sort of other academics and critics have argued erased and dismissed the indigenous people that were living here. So I agree with what the Wilderness Act says and sets aside. And I think that it can be only strengthened by acknowledging the state of this land before Europeans came and colonized it. Because I think those arguments have been used to undermine it. I feel like there's been sort of an incomplete reevaluation of our older wilderness ideas that began to a positive reexamination of those by saying, well, just remember when you talk about it being, a landscape where man isn't dominant, there were people living here. And that's true. And part of, not wilderness, but, national parks do protect cultural historic areas and things like that. But anyway, I don't know if that kind of answers your question a little bit, but that it's sort of both of those things. And I think it actually, yes, it is set aside not for people, but we also need to acknowledge that these places, there were people living here, and you can't pretend that wasn't the case. And but we have to preserve them because there's people, there's people everywhere, and we do need to set aside some places that are just for natural ecosystems to kind of repair them or let them be intact.
Was there actually a case in this story where Native Americans farming oysters, or?
No, actually, as I found researching the book, there were not native populations of oysters in the Bay Area, at least as recently as over 1,000 years ago. And I'd thought that there'd been all these native oysters in San Francisco Bay, but actually they were imported from Washington and New York and other parts on the East Coast by oyster businessmen around the gold rush. And so that's in here too. So there aren't any stories of Native Americans harvesting oysters per se, other things. So, and I did talk to the chief of the local tribe that once lived in that area, and it was really interesting, because he's a modern person with modern businesses, and and yet is kind of tasked with carrying on this sort of spiritual heritage of the place as well. And so that was a really interesting dichotomy to encounter. So I tried to incorporate as many of those voices as I could.
Are there any similar cases to this anywhere else in North America or the rest of the world?
To this particular case, not to my knowledge, but there are instances everywhere where they have tried to kind of pry open protected areas for different reasons. We've, people following the news with the Arctic right now, issues with whether that'll be wilderness or what's going on. So I didn't find a case that was really like this. There was an issue with an Indian trader outpost that people compared this to, where he was in a national park, but it wasn't a wilderness area, so it's a sort of bit of a different story.
So it sounded like this actually did go through the court system.
Yes, it did.
It seems conceptually like it should be legally, it seems like if it's in the wilderness, it shouldn't be allowed.
Right.
The contract expired, and so the contract's finished. Was there any more legal precedent that was set, or was the court case mostly just?
Well, to be spoilers, I guess you can see this in the news, the oyster farm was shut down, and they did not compromise the Wilderness Act. So it did go through the courts, and they did petition the Supreme Court, but they said no. So it almost went as high as it could, but it didn't. Many people agree with you that it was absolutely clear cut, and it was only a lot of smoke and mirrors that confused it in the process. Because it was designated in 76 as wilderness, and the 64 Wilderness Act dictates what wilderness is. But there was confusion in the process, and not everybody agreed on what wilderness means. And that's why I thought that getting at the core of what is wilderness was such an important issue in this book, because you had Senator Dianne Feinstein writing in defense of the oyster farm, saying this is not a wilderness area. Even though it had been designated as one 36 years prior, she said this is not a remote wilderness. There's cattle ranches and dairy farms on all sides. It's this such and such close to San Francisco. It doesn't count. And so that was what was interesting to me, is who decides what's wilderness and why does it count as wilderness? And that's why I think it is such an important case going forward, of that you can't just come and say, well, actually this place is a bit messed up, so let's just scrap the whole wilderness thing about it and take it away. So that was the argument, is, okay, well, we said it was wilderness, but maybe we should take that back, because on second thought, maybe not so much. But it is wilderness. They won, so.
So when the Lange family took over, is that how you say it? The Lange?
The Lange, yeah.
Yeah, the Lange family took over in, I think, 2005, was it?
Yeah, the sale closed in 2005.
Was it their intent to sort of be to fight that concept of the wilderness, or?
I don't know if they wanted to fight the concept of the wilderness. I know that they grew up, Kevin Lange, who bought the farm, grew up next door, and his goal seemed to be that he would really work to clean up the farm, and then it would be able to continue. It was a very lucrative business. Recently they mentioned that last year, I believe, the oyster farm made about $5 million, which isn't, it's not huge, but it's a lot. It's more than I make. So there's a lot of initiatives, and I know that they were really fond of the business, and I think it seems that their motivations, they thought if they could just show that they were good environmental stewards, which is why there were so many fights about the science, is that they were accused of being poor environmental stewards that were like, how can you say that? We're working so hard to clean up this area, because their predecessors had a lot of environmental problems, which I was really shocked the more research I did, how extensive they were. So they had a lot to clean up. I think they just kind of got in over their head.
Any thoughts for your next book? Is that even?
I don't know if I can talk about it.
Yeah.
So I do have a couple things I've been working on. I joked on Twitter about a novel, but it's don't hold your breath. No, I have a couple of nonfiction projects that have been in the works, and
cool.
that that I've pitched to my agent, but not to any publishers. So we'll see what gets picked up next.
Do you think nonfiction sort of a medium that you're going to stick with for a little bit?
I
or-
really love it.
Yeah.
I love research. I made a joke about, that I could probably write about research libraries the way some people write love poems. And so that excites me, and I like historical stuff. So both of my next projects are very historic based, but I want to, like one of my favorite writers is Eric Larson, and I think he does such a wonderful job of finding all this great, rich historical detail and telling it like a novel. And so I'd like to get better at doing that.
Awesome.
That's
yeah,
my plan.
definitely a need
Yeah.
for it.
In an ideal world, or if you didn't have to pay attention to the legislation or whatnot, what do you think would have been, like in your opinion, what would you have done
If I was the deciding person.
if you were the
in this.
decider and there was
Yeah.
no
Oh, gosh.
law that you had to pay attention to?
So if there was no wilderness designation, see, that's an interesting question, because if there wasn't a wilderness designation, I heard I'm avoiding your question a little bit, I heard other people argue that there's no reason why the farm couldn't have existed peacefully as long as they always followed the regulations. My observation is that they did not always follow the regulations, and that it's very difficult to make all your employees follow the rules and understand why you have to follow particular rules, because sometimes they don't seem logical to you. And you can say, look, I know this environment, I know what it needs, but you're not always right. So it's tricky. So I think, I don't know, it's hard. I mean, being a local too, it was very scary to come up against information that made it suggest maybe the farm should have gone. Because you're going to get a lot of pushback. But that was the impression that I got by the end. So I feel that the farm itself, the infrastructure just wasn't environmentally sound enough. If they could have completely started, had tons of money to just pull everything out of the estuary and start over from scratch with this totally green operation that didn't have the decades of, environmental issues, then no wilderness designation, and nobody ever goes near the baby seals, and all that stuff, they maybe could have worked something out. But unfortunately, that whole scenario just wasn't the case.
Thanks so much, Summer, for joining us, and thanks for coming to Google.
Thanks so much
Everybody
for
go
having
buy
me.
the book if you haven't already. And support Summer's work. It's great. Thank you.
Thanks so much.